Hello, and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Before we begin, please hit the like button if you like the video, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more from me, and you can always join my Patreon. We have a big goal there, and I will talk about that at the end of the video. I will never forget the first time I heard this story. We were living in a house in Shadow Mountain here in St. George, and the kids were sitting at the table doing their homework. Jason and I were on the couch watching Forensic Files, which, looking back, I probably shouldn't have let my 12-year-old listen to. The forensic stuff was so new and so fascinating, and I considered it educational for the kids, but it was very dark subject matter. This case taught me so much about blood spatter analysis, but it also had an element that was something you only see in movies. The victim, the dead woman, it appeared, had written the killer's name in her own blood. This is the story of the murder of Karen Pannell. I'm your host, Stacy Lee. Let's get into it.
We have Permenter on the way. What's the problem? I don't know. She's laying there. She did what? She's laying here. Is she conscious? No. Is she breathing? I don't know. She is laying on the floor. There's blood everywhere.
October 11th, 2003. The call you just heard came into the Oldsmar, Florida 911 dispatch center. The caller is a man named Tim Permenter, and he is calling to say he has found his girlfriend, Karen Pannell, on the floor of her house, not breathing. The dispatcher repeatedly tries to get Tim to go to Karen and touch her to see if she is cold, but he keeps saying he doesn't want to go near the body. Larry Nalvin of the Pinellas County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene and verified that Karen was in fact dead. He called in the forensics team, and soon Anna Cox, a forensic specialist, arrived as well. Karen Pannell was found on her kitchen floor with obvious stab wounds to her body. She also had defensive wounds to her arms and her hands. Police began to investigate this crime scene, and right off the bat, there is something very unusual, something that catches their eye. On the wall above Karen's body, there are letters written in blood. They are R-O-C. The letters were very close to the ground and could have been within reach for Karen. So the first thing Anna Cox does is examine Karen's hands. As you can see here, there is blood on the tips of Karen's fingerprints, as if she has, in fact, dipped them in her own blood to write the letters on the wall above her. Police and investigators are stunned. This is something you only see in the movies. None of them, in all the crime scenes they had attended, had ever actually seen a case where the victim writes the name of the killer in their own blood. They all assumed this was Karen's attempt at naming her killer, even knowing she was dying, so that he could be caught after she was dead. It's an incredible thing when you think about it, and I've often thought about this scenario. If I was lying on the ground bleeding to death or stabbed to death, I am definitely going to write my killer's name in my own blood. I'm petty, even from beyond the grave. I want that person to get caught. But this rarely happens. In fact, I only know of a couple of cases where it's happened. I know there was one where a female doctor, I think it was either Italy or Spain, was stabbed multiple times, and she wrote a couple of letters from the killer's name in her own blood. And then there was another case where a man killed another man because he wanted his girlfriend. So it does happen, but it is very rare. The crime scene was very bloody. There had been a violent struggle in the small kitchen area, and police noticed the blood trail continued even outside. A stone bird bath had been knocked over in the yard, and there was a pin from the sliding glass door on the patio concrete. Remember those pins in the older sliding glass doors that kind of look like a big bobby pin? The other thing that was very noticeable at the scene was a large pizza box. 3 slices of that pizza were missing. Investigators took the pizza box into evidence along with other items from the scene. Karen's body was removed, and the hunt for the killer was on. The first thing the police did was try and narrow down the time of Karen's death. That was not very difficult because they had quite a bit of evidence to work with. Karen had called the pizza parlor and ordered the pizza around 8:30, and it was delivered at 8:48 that evening. It was a Friday. But here's the thing. At autopsy, the pathologist found there was no pizza in Karen's stomach. She had not eaten even a bite of that pizza. So that was obviously a huge clue, because the assumption police made, the assumption I would make, is that Karen's killer ate the 3 pieces of pizza that were missing. Tim Permenter called 911 at 10:30 a.m. on Saturday morning. But with the help of the coroner, they can determine body temperature and that type of thing. It was determined that Karen had been killed around 10 p.m. Friday evening. Karen Pannell was a 39-year-old woman born in 1964 in Germany. As soon as I started researching Karen, it was obvious that she had done some modeling. These are the photos I found of her. They're obviously professional shots, either taken for her to model some clothing or perhaps for her portfolio. After she stopped modeling, she went to work as a flight attendant for several years, and for the past 12 years, the 12 years leading up to her death, she had worked for American Airlines as a customer service agent based in Tampa, Florida. Karen was single and she was dating. At the time of her murder, she was dating several different men. One of them was a pilot, and the other had been Tim Permenter. Had been. We'll get to that in a moment. Before that, Karen had been in a relationship with this man, Rock Herpich. Rock was an insurance adjuster by day, party animal by night. He'd had issues with drugs, and he'd also been in some legal trouble. Rock drove a Harley Davidson, and he had a pretty bad temper. He and Karen had lived together for about a year, and then they had a really bad fight, after which Karen called the police and filed a domestic battery complaint against Rock. Rock admitted that he had kicked the door in at Karen's house after their fight and admitted to the police that it wasn't the first time a woman had filed a complaint against him. Even though Karen and Rock were broken up at the time of her murder and had been for several months, they were still fighting over an expensive roll-top desk that both of them wanted to keep. From time to time, Rock would call Karen about the desk and they'd get into it over the phone. Karen's friends knew this, and they knew that Rock was volatile. The other men Karen was dating also knew that Rock was still kind of bothering Karen about this desk, and they knew that she was a little bit afraid of him. Now, Rock's name was written in blood above Karen's dead body. At first glance, this seems like an open and shut case, right? Well, Karen had recently been diagnosed with MS, which is, of course, a devastating diagnosis. She was in the early stages of the disease, but she was already having some very real concerns. Karen had been married years before to this man, Jeff Payne, and they still had a pretty good relationship. Jeff told the police that Karen was very concerned she wouldn't be able to continue working because of her MS diagnosis, and so Karen had returned to court to ask the judge to increase her alimony payments from Jeff so she could begin saving up for a time when she was not able to continue working. Was that a motive? In the beginning, the police looked first and foremost at Rock. His name was written above the victim. He was a volatile man with a temper. He and Karen were fighting over this desk. He seemed to be the obvious suspect. But the more police looked into Rock and the more they looked into the crime scene, they realized Rock wasn't their killer. First off, he had a very strong alibi. The night Karen was murdered, Rock was at his new girlfriend's house with her son having a sleepover with a bunch of his little friends. So there were more than 10 people that had been with Rock all evening, well past midnight and the time it was determined Karen had been murdered. But there was something even more telling, and it's fascinating. This is why I remember this case so well. Back in 2004, 2005, when this episode of Forensic Files would have aired, blood spatter technology was all the rage in the true crime and scientific communities. I would get online and read articles about it. I watched everything I could on TV about it. It was fascinating then, and it's fascinating now, but I'll never forget what I learned from this case. When Karen was stabbed over and over, as it always does, blood splatters one way as the knife enters the body, and it spatters another way as the knife leaves the body and the killer's hand is drawn back, and usually upwards. That motion, this motion, is where most of the blood spatter comes from in a stabbing murder. Because Karen was killed in this small dining nook in her home, the blood spatter covered the wall behind her. The killer had made a terrible mistake, not understanding that forensic scientists can tell when blood ends up where it does in relation to other blood around it. You guys know I love this stuff. The blood spatter on the wall behind Karen, the tiny little droplets that landed there during her murder, had dried completely before the name Rock was written in blood over the top of the blood spatter. Fascinating. That means that the letters ROC were written on the wall at least 15 minutes after the stabbing. Karen Pannell was not alive 15 minutes after the stabbing. The coroner provided a statement to police saying that the stab wound here to the back would have severed her spinal column, which most likely would have paralyzed Karen, making it impossible for her to write that name on the wall. But say it didn't. Say by some chance it did not paralyze her. The blood loss from this and the other stab wounds would have caused massive and rapid blood loss that would not have allowed Karen to live for even 3 to 4 minutes after infliction, let alone 10 to 15 minutes, the amount of time it would have taken for the blood droplets from the stabbing to dry completely. There was no possible way that Karen Pannell wrote those letters on the wall. Her killer had done it to try and frame Rock Herpich, Karen's ex-boyfriend, for her murder. Still, the police took fingernail clippings from Rock, and they also took DNA along with his fingerprints. Rock's fingerprints were obviously all over the house because he had lived there for a year. But guess where his fingerprints were not? They were not on the pizza box. Rock Herpich was cleared as a suspect. Can you imagine the relief? Can you imagine finding out that your ex has been murdered and that your name has been written in blood above their dead body? You would think your life was over, that you were about to go down for something you didn't do, right? Imagine that phone call. Hey, so-and-so, your ex is dead and your name's written in blood at the crime scene. Rock Herpich was saved by the forensic sciences and by cold hard facts, which is how any case should be handled. They're not always, as we know, clearly, but should be. There's something else very important that you need to know. The hand of Karen's that had been dipped in blood, obviously by her killer, was her right hand. Karen Pannell was left-handed. She never wrote with her right hand and she never ate with her right hand. She was very dominantly left-handed. Her killer obviously did not know this or didn't know Karen well enough to remember this about her in such a stressful moment. Now, if you're dying and you're struggling to name your killer, could you write with your non-dominant hand? Of course you could. So when I heard this, it didn't hold all the weight to me. The blood evidence, on the other hand, did. It was undeniable. Rock did not kill Karen. So who did? Obviously, police looked into the men Karen was seeing romantically. One was a pilot she met at work. This was a married man, and he was never named to protect his identity. It's always funny how some cheating partners get their names in the paper and others don't on these cases, isn't it? I always wonder why that is and how that is. But anyway, the pilot had a rock-solid alibi. He was actually in the air and then in a foreign country when Karen was killed. So there was no way. The next obvious suspect was Tim Permenter, the man who called 911 after finding Karen deceased. The police asked Tim where he had been Friday night. Tim told them that he did see Karen at about 7 o'clock, but he was gone by 7:30. Tim said he left Karen's house and went home and played video games with his roommate George. And then they both went to George's girlfriend's house after that. Tim claims that he slept at George's girlfriend's house. The next morning, he got up and tried to call Karen's phone, but she didn't pick up. He said he called several times and she never answered, so he got concerned. Tim said he drove over to Karen's and knocked on the door, and when he did, the door moved and he saw it was partially open. That made him very worried and he cautiously went inside. He immediately found Karen murdered on the floor and called 911. Tim willingly gave his fingerprints, his DNA, and even the clothing he had been wearing when he found Karen. So the police went to confirm Tim's alibi. George, his roommate, confirmed that he and Tim had been together all night on Friday night, and that yes, they had gone to George's girlfriend's house and spent the night there. The police had no choice but to let Tim go. But during his interview, Tim made sure to tell the police over and over that Rock was very abusive, very angry, very volatile, and very dangerous, and he was sure that's who had killed Karen. Karen had a really good friend named Catherine, and Catherine came forward and told the police they needed to look into Karen's ex-husband, Jeff. Like I said earlier, Karen was in the process of trying to get more alimony from Jeff. She was concerned that she wasn't going to be able to work because of her MS diagnosis. The police talked to Jeff. He said that he and Karen had actually had a really good marriage, but they divorced because Karen became mean and explosive when she drank. And according to Jeff, it was too often for him. They divorced, but they remained friends. This interested the police, but then they found out and confirmed that Jeff was in Miami, 4.5 hours away on a diving excursion when Karen was killed. Jeff not only had a witness, but also a dated and timed receipt for the trip that he had paid for. The case stalled. The police had spoken with all of the usual suspects, and all of them had very strong alibis. But then one of the officers going through phone records noticed something. A few weeks before her murder, Karen had called 911 and then hung up. As you know, anytime you call 911 and hang up, a police officer is dispatched to your house to see what is happening, and that's exactly what happened in this case. When the officer arrived at Karen's house, Karen reported that she'd had an argument with her boyfriend Tim, but that he had already left the house. And that was that. But police had to wonder, why did Karen call the police while she was arguing with Tim? Was she afraid of him? Well, Tim Permenter was a man with a very dark past and a lot of secrets. Karen met Tim when she went into a VW dealership to look at buying a new car. Tim was the car salesman at that dealership, and they met there and started dating. Karen had no way of knowing where Tim had been just before he started working at that dealership. Tim had been in prison. A few weeks before Karen's murder, she and Tim were watching TV in her bed, and the show they were watching was about people with secret identities. As Karen talked about how strange she thought it was that people could do such evil things, Tim reached down into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. He told her he had something to confess to her, and he showed her his criminal history. Tim was a criminal, and not just a criminal, he was a felon who had done 12 years in prison. His criminal history dated all the way back to the 1990s. Tim had been involved in car thefts and small robberies, and then in 1990, he'd become a pimp. Tim had a few girls he was pimping out, and then he opened up and ran his own escort service. I guess that's when he got this really super nifty and really well done tattoo. I guess this is supposed to be a woman, and underneath it is written Escort King. Seriously, Tim, that is a bad tattoo. Now, Tim was from a pretty prominent family. His grandfather, Alex Finch, was an attorney and had actually served as the mayor of Clearwater, Florida in the 80s. Then his grandfather was murdered by a client in 1989. Tim started these escort services and ran them out of Gainesville and Tallahassee. And at one point, he got into a war with a rival pimp. Tim and one of his hoodlum buddies armed themselves and went to go and confront this rival pimp. They got to his apartment, the Capitol Ridge Apartments to be precise, and Tim took a shot at this other pimp, and the pimp shot back. There's a lot of pimps involved here. Both his rival and Tim were hit with bullets, and Tim was arrested shortly after that. Tim's escort service was called Esquire Escorts, and they charged $100 an hour. The escort got $65 of that, and Tim got $35. He was grossing $6,000 a day by the time he was 20 years old. I am in the wrong business. I think I would make a really good madam. Maybe I should. But anyway, Tim's name was even in the paper when it was alleged his escorts were hired to have sex with basketball player Dwayne Schneider. Is that how you say that? Tim would go on to blow all of his money on cars and motorcycles and jacuzzis, lots of drugs. And by the time he was arrested, he didn't have that much. So Karen is sitting in bed, shocked at what she's hearing. This whole entire history just comes spilling out of this guy that she's been dating for 3 months. And she finds out he's been in prison for 12 years for attempted murder and racketeering and prostitution. And she was mortified. The very next day, after Karen found this all out about Tim, she called him and broke it off. Tim flew into a rage. He came over to Karen's house, they got into a physical fight, and he choked Karen for trying to break up with him. Her friend Catherine later said that she noticed Karen was wearing a turtleneck on a hot day at work, and she pressed her about it. Karen had these great big bruises around her neck from Tim's hands. See, my friends, this is why we call the police and we make reports when someone is abusive. They need to be in the system. Karen never reported this. So the police realized when they very first showed up on the scene of Karen's murder, Tim Permenter had actually been lying to them when he said he was Karen's boyfriend. They were broken up. Karen had dumped him. The police had actually discovered Tim Permenter's criminal record on the night that Karen had called 911 and then hung up. The arriving officer did a background check on Tim and discovered his record on that night, but there really wasn't anything they could do because Karen didn't want to press charges and Tim had already left the house. Tim was starting to look better and better to the police. While the police were investigating, the forensics team had been continuing to examine the evidence. They took the pizza box from the crime scene and sprayed it with chemicals that make fingerprints turn blue and purplish blue. They were happy to see that after the test, there were some very clear and readable fingerprints on that pizza box. Remember, Karen didn't have any pizza in her stomach. She hadn't eaten even a bite, but there were 3 slices missing. And guess whose fingerprints were all over that pizza box? Tim Permenter's. The police tracked down the delivery guy from Pizza Hut, and he told the police that Tim was in the house with Karen when he delivered that pizza and that Tim had scowled at him. Now remember, Tim said he left the house at 7:30. That pizza didn't get there till almost 9. The police went back to Tim and told him about the fingerprints on the pizza box. Tim said that yes, he had gone over to Karen's house that evening. He'd already told them that. And then the police said, well, you went over there and said you left at 7:30. The pizza didn't come till almost 9. The police had a theory that Tim had gone over to Karen's house to try and get back together with her. And they said that to him. Tim said no, he didn't even want to admit that they'd ever broken up. Apparently, Tim didn't know that Catherine, Karen's friend, had been talking to the police and had told them Tim and Karen weren't even together. They could tell that Tim was nervous, but they didn't have quite enough at the time to arrest him. So the police went back to George, Tim's roommate, who had verified that Tim had been with him all night. Well, actually, George said it wasn't all night. He wasn't sure where Tim had been all night long. Yes, he could have slipped out. He didn't have eyes on him all evening and into the early morning hours of Saturday. And then the DNA evidence came back. Police had gathered scrapings from underneath Karen's fingernails, and the skin under her nails belonged to Tim Permenter. There was a perfect DNA match. Tim's DNA was also mixed in with the blood at the crime scene, and that was enough. They had him. Tim Permenter had killed Karen Pannell after she broke up with him and refused to take him back. She let him in the house to talk to her, and for that, she was murdered. With all the evidence against him and the arrest, Tim Permenter went on trial. October 2007. After the attorneys were finished and the forensic science had been presented at trial, Tim Permenter took the stand. It turned out to be a huge mistake. During his testimony, Tim accused Karen of lying to a sheriff's deputy 10 days before her murder on the day that she had called 911 and hung up. Well, the jury hadn't even heard about this 911 call. It wasn't allowed into evidence. So Tim's statement triggered the judge to send the jury out of the room so this could be discussed. The prosecutors jumped on the chance, saying that Tim had now opened the door for them to discuss his violent behavior and the reason for the 911 call 10 days before the murder. And the judge agreed. So in came the rest of the evidence. A lot of times these guys think they're so smart that they can talk their way out of anything, when the smartest thing you can do is just keep your mouth shut. Their egos just don't allow them to do that, and a lot of times it comes back to bite them in the ass. The jury found out that Tim Permenter had 16 felonies and had served time in prison for an actual gunfight in Leon County that had taken place in 1991. And on top of that, new cell phone evidence was introduced. At 9:32 on the night of the murder, Tim used his cell phone to call his roommate George. The call bounced off a cell tower near Karen's house. And remember, this is 2 hours after Tim said he left Karen's. So Tim taking the witness stand, thinking he's smarter than everybody, thinking he can talk his way out of this, just turned out to be a colossal screw up. The prosecutor said to Tim while he was on the stand, "You shut her mouth for good on October 10th, didn't you?" "No, sir, I didn't," replied Tim. He was still trying to deny everything. They brought in the pizza delivery man who testified that he arrived at Karen's house around 9 p.m. that evening when she was murdered, and that he did in fact see Tim in the house. And again, this is 90 minutes after Tim had told the police he'd gone home. Tim's only response was, "I guess it was later on than I thought. I've been off on times. Does that make me a murderer?" No, Tim, it does not. But the fact that your skin was under Karen's fingernails sure as hell does. The fact that you dipped the wrong hand of hers in her own blood and wrote Rock's name on the wall trying to frame him sure as hell does. The fact that you strangled her and left bruises on her 10 days earlier sure as hell does. The only person that showed up in court to support Tim Permenter was his mother, Donna Finch, also known as Donna Markham. After deliberating for only 4 hours, the jury found Tim guilty of first-degree murder on October 24th, 2007. I found Tim Permenter very easily by way of an inmate search. He is currently housed at the Liberty Correctional Institute in Bristol, Florida. He's been there since June of 2004, and he is serving a life sentence. As you can see here, he has a very long list of serious crimes committed. This is a very scary guy. I wouldn't be surprised if Karen is not the only person he has killed. I feel really sorry for Karen. She broke up with this guy when she found out he had a criminal history, a violent criminal history. She tried to be nice to him. She let him back into her house, and for that she lost her life. There are crazy women out there. Don't think for 1 second that there are not, because we talk about them. They kill. We cover it here all the time. I just wish that women could live their lives and go out at night and date without the fear that the man smiling next to them might be their killer. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death True Crime Tuesday. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and you can always join my Patreon. We have a goal there, and it's this. We would like to raise money to donate to police departments that have cold case DNA in storage that has never been tested because there's no money. There are thousands of sexual assault kits sitting in refrigeration that have never been tested. They cost between $500 and $750 to test. We would like to raise money, pick a case, get that kit tested, and possibly solve a crime. The other thing that happens is we get that perpetrator's DNA in the system forever. If they've committed other crimes, we might help with that too. I sure appreciate you guys. You are the best. You are so supportive, and I'm so happy that you're here. I know you have a lot of options of things to watch, and the fact that you choose to spend a little time with me, it means a lot. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other, and I will see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.